Okay, I think we're live. Yeah, deep breath, no kidding. That feels like apt for the moment. Okay, well, welcome. Thanks to Akila and Jasmine and Jen and Iraq for joining today, and for folks who are out there, wherever you are in the world. Really excited to have this conversation in this moment, and excited that folks are here for it. So the conversation today is about reparenting and belonging. So we'll say more in a second about what reparenting is, but I feel personally super grateful to be here with 4 people who have taught me a lot about that concept, and continue to do so. So what we're going to invite Akila, Iraq, Jasmine, and Jen to do in the next 80 minutes or so is 4 things. We'll start with introductions here in just a second. We'll talk a bit about why reparenting as a concept is important for transformation for ourselves and everyone else. My sincere hope is that you all will explore with each other the questions that are live for you right now, what's coming up in your life and in this conversation, and take the conversation in that direction. And then we'll close by inviting everyone to share a practice, something concrete that you have found in your life to help get at or get into reparenting as a concept. So that's what we're hoping to do. And my goal is to support the conversation that wants to emerge. So if it's not that, that's fine too. Before we jump into introductions, just a bit of context. So my name is Brian Stout. I'm a middle child, father of 2 little kids who may come bursting in at any moment. I'm a former US diplomat. I'm a lifelong connector, a trained mediator, and a network weaver. And I'm joining today from lands traditionally stewarded by the Shasta people here in Southern Oregon, in the town of Ashland. I'm helping shepherd an emergent collaborative called Building Belonging, which is an online home for people who are committed to building a world where everyone belongs. If you want to find out more about that, buildingbelonging.us. Today's discussion is part of a series we're calling Conversations on Transformation. And basically, it's an effort to highlight different aspects of how transformation happens at every level, for ourselves, interpersonally, for society, and for systems. And all of these we're viewing through the lens of belonging, just as a way to get at it. So we think there's something transformative and powerful just about gathering together in community. And we're living through a set of intersecting crises that are overwhelming on the best of times. So the fires here in the West Coast, I can still see smoke out my window here. The pandemic that is now approaching 1 million deaths around the world. Global uprising for racial justice in the face of police violence. There might even be a verdict or non-verdict or non-decision today in Breonna Taylor's case. So it's real for lots of folks, and invite everyone to think about how you're resourcing yourself and finding ways into the conversation this moment. The one I'll offer here is a line from Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, who was part of our last conversation. She said recently for On Being, the quote is, "The distance between the reality that we experience and the possibility that we long for is the actions that we take." So for me, part of how I'm holding this tension is to understand that how I show up day to day is actually part of bringing into being the world that we try to live in. So before we dive in, I'm going to invite everyone, myself very much included, just to take a deep, slow breath together. Find out and just pay attention to where you're carrying tension in your body. For me, jaw, chest, definitely. A little anxiety around speed here and time. So just to hold space for the suffering that we know everyone is experiencing collectively, without being overwhelmed by it. And invite folks who are following along live to center with us in your intention for our time together today. What drew you here? What are you hoping to get from this conversation? How do you want to show up and be present? Thank you. With that, we will go to introductions. So we're going to start with Akila and the proposal, the invitation for you to take or not, as you see fit, is take maybe 3 minutes or so. There's a couple prompts you can choose to take up or not. I am, my people are, and I belong to.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Y'all hear me okay? Good, good, good. Actually, Iraq mentioned an opening that felt good for all of us to be with. And Iraq, if that's still cool, you want to do that first, or you want me to go?
What was it? Will you remind me?
You were talking about opening up with a particular word, or just, you know, doing some, or was that it? I thought you were gonna do.
Oh,
yeah.
bless. No, I'm sorry for the miscommunication.
That's
but
okay.
yeah, no, I appreciate Brian brought us into that breath. And I think just kind of like being present where we are, finding our place, folks watching, making sure, you know, grab that cup of water, do what you need to do. That's it. Just kind of bringing people in so we can connect and kick it. Thank you, Akila.
Yes, you are very welcome. All right, peace, y'all, friends watching and new people. I'm Akila. I will deviate from the prompt and just chat a little bit to say that I love these types of conversations. I am a writer in terms of how I am and how I process things. And so language is both, like written and spoken language is both the thing that I rely on to like understand and also to communicate. And it's also something that I understand to be like super limiting and not even consensual. Yes. So I live in between that space of communicating in a way that is articulate, not in terms of how we understand it colonially, but in terms of like really being able to share like feeling and connection and belonging. And a lot of my education with that began when I became Marley's mama and then Sage Nyambi's mama. So I have two, I call them mine, but I also say, you know, they own themselves. Marley and Sage Nyambi are girls. They are 16 and 14, and they have been very much why I'm sitting in a space with people talking about belonging. So I am an unschooler along with Marley and Sage and my partner, Chris. We are, until this pandemic, we were location independent. So we were nomadic, living in different cities, countries, just being together and learning together. I've been writing and sharing space about how unschooling has been very much liberation work for my family. And then it turns out that a bunch of Black folks do this too, and that it is actually ours first, as my friend Kelly Limes Taylor talks about. And I really appreciate that. And so I love to be in spaces where these conversations are happening. And that's it, just happy to be here to talk about belonging and really what it means to together good. Yeah.
Invite Jen to go next, and then we'll go Jasmine and Iraq.
Hello, my name is Jen. I am a parent and a wife and a researcher and a learner. I host a podcast on parenting and child development and taking scientific research on those topics and translating it into tools that parents can use, and always with an eye to seeing the limitations of that research and the biases that are built into that research and what we need to do to understand those and overcome those. The prompts to me were were super revealing, I think, because when I started to think, you know, my people are, well, they're in England and I'm here. My home is on the land of the traditional lands of the Chochenyo Ohlone in Berkeley, California, but I'm here on Ute land right now in Colorado, fleeing wildfire smoke because of the ways that my people, I have to say, have mismanaged forests for 100 years now. And so, yeah, so I am not in touch with my where I belong. And I think that there's a big part of that that's linked to the conversation that we're going to have today. And then in terms of what I belong to, I actually kind of pivoted that to think about what I belong in. And I feel like I belong in a world where parents are starting to see the disconnects between the ways that they were raised and the way that they want their children to be raised and the lives they want their children to have. And seeing that, well, if we raise our children in the same way that we were raised, then we're going to get a similar result out the other end. And if we want a different result, we have to shift our practice in some way. And firstly, becoming aware of that. And then secondly, okay, well, now we know about it. What on earth do we do about it? And really supporting parents through that transitional process is something that I'm profoundly involved in and getting a lot of satisfaction and presence in at the moment.
It's my turn, is that right? Great. Well, hello, my name is Jasmine. I am so grateful to be here. My pronouns are she, her, and I am in the River Valley in Arkansas, which is Caddo, Quapaw, and I believe Osage land. I'll follow the prompt because I'm a Virgo and I love to be like, you got an A+ because you did what you were told. And I'm always in like constriction with my Scorpio rising to be like, nah, you gonna do what you wanna do. But today I'm gonna channel Virgo. So my people I am descendant of the Cherokee people, and I'm definitely gonna share some of that in the later part of our conversation around practice. My people are the trans, intersex, queer folks. My people are the Black radical feminists. My people are the dispossessed within all of those spaces. My people are the non-monogamous poly folks, the communities who have survived childhood sexual assaults and adult violence. And my people are like the organizers and the not do it so well or so right, but always commit to being less wrong with each action and choice. I belong to me first and foremost. I belong to a commitment to be expansive and generative and curious. And yeah, I would say those are the things about me.
Hey yo, I think I'm in here. I made a decision to come outside, so I apologize for this light glare, but we're just gonna use it on a meta. If I was to say who I am, it's funny because that was a prompt. 19-year-old me would have said, I'm hypocrisy searching for an answer. I'm the opposition to all of this nationalist propaganda. I'm the reason for the COINTELPRO slander. I'm the Young Lords, the Mau Mau's, and the Black Panthers. And I still am. Also, I'm a parent. I'm a father. It's one of the most incredible blessings. I'm alive. I'm grateful for that. My people are survivors, thrivers, moving towards liberation for all people. My people are from the diaspora. My people are from the Borinquen, Boricua. I love that Jasmine. I'm already nicknamed Jazz. I love that Jasmine. I belong to myself. I belong to my people. I belong to my spirits and my energy, and the gods that I love, and the way in which, you know, I belong to my babies too, to my children, right? And so let's see what my people are. Thank you for this prompt. My people are. I'm also an organizer, educator, facilitator, curandero. My institutional support, because people be like, who you work for? And I'd be like, my people. My institutional support is from United for a Fair Economy, where I have an incredible, formerly undocumented refugee leader, popular educator, grandmother of 23, mother of 9. Jeanette Wessel is my I apprentice for Jeanette. And let's see, I'm a circle keeper, MC. Often I am, I'm comfortable in my own skin. And so I'll end on that. I'm grateful to be here.
Yeah, just want to sit with all that. I love these prompts because people always take them wherever they want to go, which is where I want to go too. So thanks for bringing that into the room. I had the pleasure of preparing for this conversation to remind myself how I encountered all of your work and yourselves. And it's, you know, I think one of the things that excites me about this conversation is that a lot of the parenting spaces that are out there that I'm in do not look quite like this. And that's part of what we're trying to bring is a more textured conversation around what this work looks like, parenting and reparenting. So we wanted to ground into reparenting as a concept. It's not necessarily intuitive. I learned about it through Jasmine, actually. She has this amazing podcast, Parenting is Political, with her partner, which you can say more about. But yeah, the invitation here is to share a bit about what reparenting means for you, why it's important for transformation. And then we'll kind of move around the circle, and I'll offer a couple of prompts for each of you. Bless you, Kila. But also feel free to take in whatever direction you want. Jasmine.
Awesome.
And maybe 3 or 4 minutes each.
Thank you. If I speak too long, someone will have put their hand up and let me know. So reparenting really entered my life. My educational background is I have a psychology communications degree and with emphasis in behavioral neuroscience. Did a lot of self-teaching around behavioral neuroscience. And then my graduate education is in community counseling. And I've been on this journey of critical consciousness for much of my life, although I would have never framed it that way. That because I have been in higher ed and academic spaces is the language, the vehicle for which they create those frames. But reparenting was really taught to me in the beginning of my undergrad career and then in graduate school as a clinical model that emerged in the 1960s. And it is both a clinical and practical modality that you engage with your client base as a clinician. And the theory supposes in the clinical setting that the clinician takes on the parent ego and the client becomes their inner child. And through a exchange in that sacred space of clinician, caretaker, healer, you are able as the client to emerge new narratives of identity and create deeper space of healing for the ways in which you were not properly parented or you weren't given what you needed as a young person. And so the implications historically, when we're looking at this through an anti-oppressive lens, that frame comes from a very cis, het, white, ivory tower analysis. And it was also being influenced by the new age positive psychology movement, which was very white, deeply colonizing. And what it was doing was what whiteness always does, which is take sacred indigenous Black knowledge and reframing it into some practical use that can then be commodified, that can be, have a return on investment and can be preached rather than it being something that is about agitating and abolishing the American experiment that used both the state and the church and then higher education as an extension to subjugate and further enslave and colonize people. And so I learned in undergrad, and then whenever I graduated, I went to work. My specialization was around, quote unquote, what in the higher education institution, they say the worst of the worst people. So my clients straight out of grad school, I'm pregnant with my second daughter, Addison, newly pregnant, and I'm in charge of 30 active schizoaffective or schizophrenic clients, as well as folks who have been identified as sociopathic, psychotic, and narcissist or borderline. And so those are considered the populations that just have to be handled and managed. And reparenting can often be offered as a modality for giving them some relief, because within the white capitalistic heteropatriarchy lens, your parents failed you and that's why you're having these delusions. And if you can just have a better parent. So here I was in my early 20s, pregnant AF, still on the edge of my radicalization around Mike Brown and Trayvon's life happening. And I'm trying to reparent all these schizoaffective white geriatric and middle-aged people. But what emerged for me as I moved on this journey of developing a critical conscious or waking up to the ways in which I have been colonized or I have been complicit in the American experiment was that for those of us who have been captured by settler colonialism, the expansive definition or approach to reparenting is us getting back to our indigeneity, getting back to the expansiveness of our Blackness, and rejecting and creating new ways of belonging that are not defined by cisgender, heterosexual, capitalistic, patriarchal, white systems. It is essentially how we actually do the work to get free in ourselves,
Yes,
for our parents, for our children. And for white folks whose histories are absent of being colonized, y'all have been raised within the American experiment, where the state and the church have colluded to create a certain level of programming. And so for white folks who are wanting to become anti-racist, to become, to move in solidarity with Indigenous Black people, with trans people, then reparenting then becomes the anti-racism work you do for yourself. So you can create, you can correct the generational violence that was created. And it is a process that you engage in to empower yourself as a caretaker or a parent or someone who has a touch point with a young person, so that they become free and protected and have the skills they need to be in solidarity with, like, my young Black trans girl who is going to, like, go into the world, ancestors willing, decolonized and, like, ready to engage in revolution.
I say.
So this work of reparenting, around why I introduce it in Parenting is Political, why I engage in it, is like the necessary, creating the necessary conditions to raise generations that are ready to abolish the state and abolish the church and do the work and reimagine new just worlds. It's the work that I call folks into space to say, we are raising sci-fi children. They have to live in a world that does not yet exist. And we have to create the conditions that we destabilize this current iteration of society so much that when they're ready to break it apart, it falls apart. And what emerges is a new just world where Black, trans, that body, like, folks live in safety and care. So yeah, that's reparenting.
Yes.
Where my tambourines at? Right. Where my tambourines?
Sign me up. Yes, Jasmine. Woo! Felt that.
I'm gonna make the white woman follow that.
Yes.
You got set up, Brian.
Yes, Jasmine. Thank you.
I think
absolutely. I
what I
share
love
all
about
that.
Jasmine is, she starts with, like, this sort of clinical academic language, then closes with a call for revolution and liberation, which is, I think, what we're looking for here.
It's our duty to fight for our freedom. Like,
no, thank you for the invitation. I find it honestly, like, so attractive, and I think what's jarring about this is not the common discourse in parenting spaces, mainstream parenting spaces in the U.S. at least. And I think when you first hear it, when I first came across Parenting is Political and was stumbling into some of Jasmine's work, I found it very confronting, but also, like, really, like, I kept wanting more. I was like, go on. Like, I haven't heard that particular line before. Like, ooh, that resonates. Yeah, it feels about right. And I think what's attractive about this conversation, what reparenting offers, is a way for us to, I think it was really attractive, Jasmine, the way you just framed it, is like understanding our own complicity in and colonization by the systems that we're brought up in. Like, you didn't have a choice over that as a kid. And I think the reason I wanted to go to Jen next, that Jen, you can punt if you feel called, and invite Rock or Akila to step in as well, was because I think the way this lands for folks, I think all of us, but for white people in particular, is it sometimes feels like reparenting is an implicit critique of our parents. And there's a desire to not dishonor our parents who did their best, right? So I wonder if you might, speak to this question however it lands for you, but specifically to that dimension of, like, how do we hold space for what our parents try to do for us, giving them credit, while also doing the work that we need to do?
Yeah, well, firstly, massive props to Jasmine. In a way, I see myself as a person who's on that journey and still has a lot of work to do. I recognize that I'm still deeply embedded in, white, cis, het, patriarchal societal norms. And I'm opening myself up to this at the same time as I'm sort of trying to bring others along the journey as well. So, and recognizing how much more work there is to do there. And just wanted to pick up on something you said. It reminded me of a quote from Resmaa Menakem's book, My Grandmother's Hands. And he said, what white bodies did to Black bodies, they first did to other white bodies. and the idea that the violence that we carry out on other people is something that we first did to ourselves. That there's centuries and centuries of traditions of this in Europe. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that, and that this is the culture that yours, Brian, our ancestors came from and grew up in, and to expect people to grow up in these very violent cultures and then not bring that violence and carry that forward into future generations. I mean, how could we expect anything different? So when we think about the idea of where does this come from, with this idea that we need reparenting, I came to it from kind of pulling a couple of different data points. The first was an interview that I did with Dr. Arietta Slade, who's she's a world-renowned researcher on attachment theory, and she said in our interview that attachment is a pretty robust system. About 60% of children have good attachments with their parents, and I'm thinking, wait, 60%? What about the other 40%? What happens to them? And so that was kind of one data point. And then another one was when I first started exploring this idea, it was from the perspective of triggers, because I kept seeing people in parenting groups in online saying, I'm so triggered by my child's behavior. And so I have a membership for parents, and I said to them, we're going to explore this. What do you want to know? And one of them said, when can I expect my child to grow out of these behaviors that I find so triggering? And that perspective made me realize, oh, this is the way we see it. We see the child's behavior as being the problem. And that if the child's behavior is the problem, then what we need to do is fix the child's behavior, because we were here first and we were fine in the world. I didn't have that many triggers. I had a few, but not that many before my daughter was born. And now I have a whole lot more. And so when we can reframe that from seeing the child's behavior as the problem to seeing there's some kind of fracture in the relationship. There's something in the relationship that is not working here. And when we can look at that in a different way and see, okay, whose needs are not being met here and how are they not being met? Then we're in a position to shift that narrative for the next generation. And so I don't see it as necessarily a failure of the parents. Certainly there can be failures. There can be situations that the parents are doing things that we think to be wrong for whatever reason it is that they end up doing it, that, or we call them illegal or whatever these behaviors are. But there are also plenty of situations where there are kind, loving, well-meaning parents who just have this disconnect with their child. That their child has one set of needs, the parent has another set, and they just kind of go past each other and don't ever really connect. And that's not anyone's fault, it's just is. And that when we can work with that and understand that, then we're starting to make this journey that we need to make in reparenting ourselves and shifting these practices for the next generation.
I would offer a possible reframe around like attachment and needs and desire and whose fault is what, is that because of a result of how our society became industrialized and commodified the family and the tribe and separated, how the emergence of capitalism created these mismatching, it dehumanized us, that we are all oriented to attachment, and in like a kinship relative community, we don't even have to have a conversation about attachment because it's a product of being with one another. And that actually like whiteness and science and theory offers us these practices around attachment to sort of put a band-aid on the original harm, which is creating conditions where we can't be with our children, where we can't nurture them once they're born, where if we don't have the things that we that they need from us, that we feel shame, particularly as women, and how it applies to misogyny and patriarchy. If there's an auntie who can give it to them and we go send our child off to live with that auntie because it's better suited for that child's learning style and needs, then I'm a bad mama, right? That's patriarchy at work. That's capitalism at work. That's controlling of the other's body. And so I think it's useful as like a harm reduction tactic to talk about the data around attachment, but it's not like, it's stemming off, like it's harm reduction. It's not like the actual transformation work. And I don't mean to denigrate like what you've invested your life in. And I think framing it that way as temporary harm reduction while you do deeper decolonization is useful, because there are a lot of women folk in particular who had children and built families because they thought that's what they were supposed to do. And then mothering isn't actually what they want to do, but now they feel an obligation to continue to do it. And they don't have their sisters and their uncles and their cousins and their kinfolk who can come up and raise a child within a village because they're isolated and they live in suburbs and they got to be at work 9 to 5.
Yeah, because there's this set model of what a family must look like, what a parent's role is, what a child's role is, and we're constrained within that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, appreciating this and appreciating someone on the live stream just said, I love a decolonized frame. So people are appreciating that. Yeah, I think I was going to go to Iraq next. And the invitation here was without inviting Iraq to speak for all men. I think what's been a challenge for me as a man in parenting spaces is most of the spaces I found are by women and sort of for women. And I get a lot of resonance from it, the same way I do from Jasmine Nikhil's work, though I'm obviously not a Black person. And I found Iraq's work through his work on tender masculinity. And I thought what was so attractive about what Iraq was bringing was a kind of way to access fatherhood, but in a much more liberated construct than sort of the toxic masculine archetypes that patriarchy offers us. And when Jen and I did a podcast a while ago on patriarchy, and we looked for voices that were speaking to patriarchy and parenting, and specifically for male voices who were talking about it. And it was hard to find. So I'm grateful that Iraq has agreed to join us today. And so the invitation here maybe is of reparenting, to what extent, I mean, Jasmine was just speaking a little bit to the unique ways this hits and lands for women, sort of around pressure of motherhood. How you see that relating to men or to fatherhood, if there's any distinctions you want to call out there.
Can you say that again, that last part? If there's any distinctions.
Anything about the reparenting journey or experience for you that you feel like lands differently in male bodies. And again, we can deconstruct the binary here too, but just for speaking for that, that's
Thank you. I'm gonna take the prompt and run with it. I just want to say, like, if I'm feeling my spirit right now, I'm sitting, but my heart is racing in a good way. Jasmine got me in my feelings in a good way. So I'm sitting with that, and it's cooking a little bit. It's marinating in a nice way. It feels good. It feels like love. Things I didn't say earlier that I would be remiss to say is that I'm the father of 3 incredible children, Javier Albizu, Kimani Emeterio, and Nia Caraya, and their mothers, Alexia and Ayana. And just as I'm also standing on the shoulders of my parents and those before me, including my father, Felix, and my mother, Elsa, Boston public school teacher for 36 years, brown, matriarch, feminist woman who came against her will to this country. And because of that, something showed up in the home that I had to reparent. There's a lot of reasons because I appreciate you, Jasmine. That's where I'm in my feelings, you know? Because one of the things I'm constantly reminding myself is that we have to mourn what we didn't have so we can celebrate what we have and what was taken from us. And I use he, they, and the only reason I'm not jumping all the way they is because I have to be accountable to the he. Does that make sense? And I want to hold conversations with some of the folks who are using he and men and being in that space, but I am really kind of like being like, this gender thing is punk. You know, just so I want to say that as I try to be like, how do I have the conversation with the folks like that identify as men and feel like that's it used to be such a huge part of like who I'm a man. And I guess in my reparenting, I'm losing that sensation of me. So it's interesting when you said the word triggers, like thinking about like the psychological trigger of things in my babies. I'm gonna tell an anecdote. My son Javier Albizu is now 12 years old. When he was 5 years old, this is the age I was when I can remember one of the most traumatic things that ever happened to me happening. There was a moment where I was parenting him and I looked at him and I saw me for a second and I said, wait a minute, because up until then, I deserved it. You understand? I deserved it. Up until then, that point, until I'm 30 something years, I'm like, oh, I definitely like, I was a bad kid. I deserved that. And I see my son, I'm looking at him and I was like, wait a minute. Maybe I didn't deserve. Oh no. And I'm a fast forward to being locked in the bathroom, crying, calling one of my elders and being like, hey, and leaving. And my son, he was playing with fire. And the trigger was when I was a child, anything that was questioning anything would have been reprimanded incredibly deeply, like scarring ways. And I am the child of two beautiful human beings who did what they were taught. And they did some of it really beautifully to me. And I honor them, I uplift them, and I revere them, and I hold them accountable. I have actually, like, in person had that. So that this isn't going to be that, right? I've done that. And I'm down to talk to people about that as well. But what happened in that moment was like, there was a muscle memory, generational situation where I was like, I want to beat my son, but I don't want to beat my children. I would always say like, I'm never going to hit my kids. And in that moment, I was like, I really want to beat my kid. No, I don't. Yes, I do. No, and I'm triggered and I'm like, but he's deserved. But wait a minute, did I deserve? I didn't deserve. And I didn't. I'm all about, shout out to one of my sisters in work, Sadada Jackson, who says we got to go beyond the decolonize. We got to indigenize, right? It's like that funk, that next level. And in that indigenizing, I took myself to some Baba Joe in upstate New York, who sweat lodged me and a bunch of other men of color. And in that, I was like, oh my God, like, what does it mean to see some of the, then my homie, my teacher homie, Waleed, who moved me through plant medicine. And these things were helping me to get in the DeLorean. These things were helping me do some of this reparenting. I say, and I will hold my 5-year-old. And I told him, I'm sorry, I thought you deserved that. I love you. And I'll be crying tears, beautiful tears. And how are we going to not do, like, one of the things that is really incredible to these we have moments, I think, that can be like, this is a moment that shifts and changes. Like, I'll remember this moment for the rest of my life, right? We have those moments, and how we put those moments in space and time is how we integrate the lesson, right? The practice of today I'm going to practice yet again, right? And I'm going to practice and practice and practice. The triggering was actually the thing that saved my babies from being hit.
Yes.
I've never, go ahead.
And that is a very Western, that word that like, triggering is very Western trauma, suffering based. Like, your young person invited you into a moment of transformation and was a mirror for you, where you had to make a decision if you were going to be an agent of domination and continue the cycle of violence and intergenerational trauma, or if you would respond with care. And when you responded with care, that's why you saw yourself, because you were reparenting, and you were reparenting your parents, and you were reparenting all the way back to indigeneity, where all of us who have experienced the settler colonial state, whether it's been, via the United States or globally, we all are offered these moments. We don't see them as choices because the illusion is like, that child's triggering you, or that person's hurting you, or you should punish, you should isolate, you should get revenge. But those are opportunities for embodied and reflection to say, am I going to choose in this moment to be an agent of patriarchy and capitalism and violence? Right? I had that same moment where the cis white man who my daughter said, I know this is my dad, he has sexually assaulted me. I came to my mom in the same way. And when my mother, who was a survivor of familial rape and incest, said, it's your fault, what did you do? I had that moment with my child. And I've had multiple moments with my child. And I was like, do I save little Jasmine? Do I save my daughter? What do I do? And at every moment in that process, the state came in and was like, oh, there's a crime here. And here's how you feel this change, Jasmine, because you stayed, or did you know? And then society was like, you made your child say this, like all those things. So the fact that you immediately went to people, your elders, and you started plant medicine, that to me, beloved, is like, you are resilient as fuck. And you are a bright beacon in your family, like your ancestral elder lineage of like, you're a conduit. And just,
Thank you. I'm Jasmine. First of all, I just want to say out loud, because I'm definitely hitting your Cash App when this is done. Doing it. Hold me accountable, because that was a session. I'm serious. I'm legit. It's just gonna move that way. We're gonna move that energy. But one of the things that you're speaking to, that I'm speaking to here, is that in that I had to question like some of the ways in which becoming a man made me face this kind of thing of like, oh, like, first of all, why am I crying? Right? Like, even that, like, even though most women in cis hetero, and I identify, I'm queer and proud of it, and most women in cis hetero relationships will tell you, actually, men do cry. They just come to us with all of it, and we have to hold it all. Just so you know, right? Like, just to break the, like, actually, they think we are their therapists, and they will do that all with us, but they will not do it with their homies or their this or that or friends or therapists, et cetera. So I will acknowledge that. But, I went like 9 years not crying. I wasn't proud of it. It just was. I thought I was out of tears. You know what I'm saying? Like, I was like, oh, I guess I just cried a lot. And in these moments, all of a sudden, I started crying more and being in my tears and started thinking about, what does that mean for me? Right? Like, how does that? And then thinking about identity and challenging some things that I saw that I thought were present, that I knew were present in the culture that was dominant, and how it showed up, and how folks, the amount of pain and yeah, I say, suffering and grief and sorrow that men were either holding on their own or manifesting and channeling it into this like violent trauma back to the people that they say they love, right? And thinking I kind of do this thing where I like, that external, internal, right? The roomy, the wound is where the light enters. That internal kind of like, what is it about? I'm built this way. I don't know why. I have something inside of me that's always like, how does this shift in you? How do you change this in you? What is the way in which you are going to be this transformation that you're wanting, really, right? For people to do. So in this moment, it was like, how do I not beat these babies? I have 2 children. I've never hit my children. Now I work with people who hit their children to try to stop. So this ain't a judgment game. This isn't a blame or shame thing. I understand this. I'm not here about calling the state. I see what happens to those babies. I actually work with some of them as well later in their life. So, it's so many layers here. I'm often down to be like, hey, men, can we have this conversation? Can we go for that walk? Can we have that circle? Can we talk about the ways in which your inability to feel this, your feelings move through this stuff, do the work? I'll take them with me. We went deep to the sweat lodge, like 8 deep, right? We went, we're going to do this work. And this is what it is. For me, often what I know is true. And it becomes a thing when I'm having conversations with the people I love who helped to raise me is like, look, this is not a conversation about blame for me. Anything that I'm doing right now is a generational uplift for you and me. So I'm on our team. And our team right now requires that I hold you accountable for this thing that I'm shifting in me. And I want to do it in a way that like feels, and I had to get to that point. You know how 11 years of this, 10 years of that, 5 years, I had to get to these places and spaces where I can have these conversations with people. And a lot of that had to do with my relationship to transformative justice as a circle keeper. And then something I'll reiterate as a curandero, that I do not stigmatize plant medicine. It has its place. And it can be used in very good ways. And Jasmine, earlier when you was talking about how like right now you're seeing white men talk about the medicines in ways that First Nation indigenous elders have been talking about since I can absolutely remember, and getting New York Times best-selling books. And part of me is like, fine, I'm grateful, less stigmatization. But another part of me is like, are we serious right now? Did this man have one journey and write a whole book about it? And now everybody's like, whoa, maybe we should consider plant medicine in our, and I'm like, wow.
Speak on it.
So for so long, we like walk around with the supposed stigma that people who colonize somehow have the best medicine for us. The same people who would rather see us subservient, dead, colonized are going to tell me how to heal the things.
I wonder if this might
so
be
that's a good, maybe that's the time to pause.
No, I was want to do 2 things. Want to bring Akila in. There's so much here to respond to, and also just E-Rock, you said you were feeling some feelings around Jasmine sharing. Just want to reflect that back to you. I was feeling that story with your 5-year-old and Jasmine sharing some of your. That's thanks for bringing that into the room, and just invite folks to hold space for that as we go. Akila, I'll offer a prompt, but there's a lot there to respond to. So go wherever your heart is called. The thing that struck me in sort of linking the kind of Iraq's work around patriarchy and your work around sort of white supremacy is, it struck me a while back that there's something about the way men are asked to show up, projecting invulnerability and individuality, and we got this. And there's something about the way Black women and Black mothers in particular are asked to show up as like this pillar, this invulnerable pillar of the family, you know, the rock in places where men have been taken away. And I'm just curious if there's something about, in the context of belonging or in the context of reparenting, how you think about the way this conversation lands differently for Black women. If you want to speak to that, feel free. Otherwise, anything else that's up there for you?
Yeah, quite a bit. I so appreciate everything. And it also is a really great, I'm really taking full advantage of the opportunity to just listen. You know, a lot of us who do this work are often the ones, you know, I also have a podcast and do all these things, and it's nice to listen. So that felt really good. And I got so much. Yeah. And I just got and know I will continue to get so much. I think I will probably end up back to some of what you asked, Brian, but I want to really presence, you know, what arose as I was listening. And one of the things is that when we talk about Black families and Black women, a part of the myth of the monolith is that Black men have been absent. Yes, that is true. That is real. That is valid. I experienced that even with my own father. However, my uncles, my grandfather, I also have 3 brothers, like Black men have been showing up for me my whole life. And
yes.
and continue to do so. And at the same time, just like I love how Iraq talked about the importance of accountability, and I would say as a part of healing and as a part of liberation, because this way of, I'm Jamaican, right? And
yes, you are. Yes, you are.
And my parents came here. My parents came here against their will, right? They came here because they fled. They needed to be here. And that shit showed up very much in how we were raised. They were, you know, my friend Bio, who wrote the foreword for my book, talks about fugitives, like, you know, fugitives.
Maroons, yes.
You see it. And like, and even in the way that we understand that fleeing the things that don't serve us or do quite the opposite is not the same as losing ourselves, right? Like we didn't leave, like when they left, they didn't leave the things that they gathered and got from all the people who came before them. They took that with them. And so what is really arising for me here is that so much of the things that we sometimes come to from like an intellectualization or even a space of trauma can often be witnessed when there's no harm, like just witnessed. And for me, that shows up a lot in witnessing childhood, right? So for example, we talk about hitting children. Definitely under the British Caribbean colonial thing, it never crossed my mind that I would not hit my children because I love them and I want them to have a healthy fear. And I, you know, that's how, as much as I was rebellious and contrary to whatever in so many ways, that made sense in my brain, I guess, because I never even questioned it. However, I was on a talk show, I was on the Steve Harvey show some years back, and there's a woman, her first name I think is Tanya, and I do not remember her last name. And at the time, she was very popular because her son had skipped school and gone to, you know, like a protest.
In Baltimore, yeah, yes.
And, you know, people were saying, mostly it was like bigging her up, right? Mother of the year, of course, you got to do that, especially raising a Black boy, because if you don't put that fear, then the police gonna do it and blah, blah, right? And then also there was some critique of it. And I I heard all of that, but sitting on that stage with her and hearing her talk about why she did it, she gave me so much in that moment that made it clear for me that I could never hit my daughters again. Even though I'd been struggling with it, she confirmed it, because I realized that I was doing the same thing, with Marley and Sage Nyambi that she was doing in that moment. And I could recognize hers as messed up, but I couldn't recognize mine as messed up. And she offered me, in her honesty, and we butted heads, and she offered me in that space so much understanding of my why, not in a way that made it clear about why, it made it clear about why not. And and so a lot of the things that I hear when we talk about belonging, and so that was a part of my own reparenting. So when we talk about belonging, I find that the things that I happen upon after, like books and whatever the hell, a lot of that stuff just shows up in how I am able to make room for Marley and Sage Nyambi to show up as themselves. I learn a lot of those things. I work with large corporations now, and before that, a lot of nonprofits around belonging and self-directed skills in relationships, right? And so much of the things that come from, I often will be working with somebody's like equity department or, diversity and inclusion department. And so much of the stuff, and I really am saying it's snarky as fuck on purpose. And a lot of the stuff that they talk about and arrive at, I feel really grateful and equipped to talk about, because I recognize those things from just being around free people, right? Being around free people, I don't need to, for me, I don't need to focus on dismantling a thing first. I don't need to focus on the conditions of something that I want. A lot of my study, a lot of my practice it shows up and it is practiced in observing my children and recognizing, and other children, and also being with pushback, right? Like being with the moments that they resist something. I say all the time that their resistance is the roadmap. Like whatever it is that causes them to be like, yo, what you doing? That's an opportunity. That is an opportunity for me and them to do our patois, to co-create shared meaning, right? There's this thing, I brought my cards down, my patois cards. I have this thing called Parenting Patois. This says, when Mateka stop, right? This is Jamaican patois for, yo, something happened and I paused. It was like you didn't choose to pause, but something happened, it rocked your shit like a pandemic, and you paused, right? And in that pause, when it had to stop, you recognize that, for example, this push to try to get your kid to complete the packet and to spend 6 hours with 2 30-minute breaks is actually inhumane, and that you didn't have to discover that, right? You didn't have to discover that in that moment because your child showed you. It wasn't your intelligence, it wasn't your knowledge. You was just paying attention. You were just learning how to listen. And so much of that is indigenous. So much of that way of, as Jasmine talked about it, like if we had our systems in place, the ways that we intuited and connected, a lot of these ways that we could be together, and people who had babies for whatever, through different circumstances, but didn't have the things that that baby needed, and somebody else coming in, those normal dances, those ciphers that we did not have to orchestrate or create an agenda or a degree around, those are the things that we are now rehoming, right? And like re-establishing ourselves through these old practices. And so like the old and the new, the Sankofa and the sci-fi get to come together so much, I think, in
the Sankofa and the sci-fi, that's
Boom.
your new book. That's your new book.
Love it, yes.
You channeled Octavia.
Yes, so it's like both of those realities to me, and all of the things on the spectrum in between and behind and beyond, I think those things already live in the energies that ancestors choose to bring back. Like our children, I also identify as a they. because the more I understand, the more clear I am that I'm a collection and that my children are collections. And so I couldn't then, as I learn how to design liberation for myself, which is what reparenting is, I couldn't suppose what it is for my children. That's what belonging is about, to remove that supposition, replace it with like deep, spiritual, sacred observation that then informs what it means to be in partnership with that person. The same way that I observe my plant and be like, oh, it can't stay over there because it ain't got enough light because the leaves keep dying, whatever. That, I didn't have to have the download of plant care and learn all the things. The tools are important. We also attract the tools because a lot of them are also emergent. And so a part of our decolonizing is to move away from reacting to things like triggers or reacting to well-stated ideas from white people about what's actually going on, and to develop and remember the type of listening that is inherent in Black, non-Black, Indigenous, and people of color cultures, so we can heal, and also so that we can teach pervasive whiteness what that even looks like.
Yes,
you know, to show. Yeah,
that internal work. And I also want to say that, like, as we are thinking about how we do that in tribe, how we do that in community as relatives, that we have to name that we're a part of the Borg. And some of us are no longer like downloaded into the Borg. And I want to call up one of the things that you said around Black fatherhood. And because the American experiment has kept our own histories from us, and then has done such a really good job at having a marketing campaign and having people create those messages, like the myth of the absent Black father emerged in 1965. Like, it's only 55 years old. And it came during Lyndon Johnson's administration by Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And it had implications for Black fathers, but it also had implications for Latinx men that were other, and you know, brown folks, brown fathers. And it essentially was saying that racial inequity in response to the civil rights era was just because of family structure. And if Black families had the right family structures, they wouldn't have racial disparity. But what whiteness has done, whiteness and those of us who have anti-Blackness in us and have often acted as agents of whiteness, because I'll name that Obama had this same conversation about Black men and Black boys, which was directly linked back to what Moynihan had to
and the respectability politics.
Right. Was that whiteness used that report to rationalize and reaffirm the stereotype of the strong Black woman who does it by herself, who emasculates her man, of the absent wild child who needs to be controlled and needs to have religion and rules and the carceral state, and that like Black men aren't nurturers. But we know from our histories, both oral and otherwise, that that's just not true. And so a myth that has only been seeded and codified by data and science, by the way.
Empirical data
of the Black family.
Which is upheld, yes.
Right, so it's only 55 years old, and this is what it has done to devastate us in concert with the structural inequities that were created by enslavement and chattel slavery and capitalism. Come on now.
Yes, tell the truth.
Those of us Black and brown folks who are building the resistance, if we got 55 years of our narrative being primary, if our white comrades who are in solidarity with us follow our leadership, what can we do in 55 years? Because we know what our aunties and our grandmamas could do with some beans and a piece of ham hock and some weeds that do in the backyard.
And we have our versions of that now, because even our beans and all of these things, the basics, we can take these things. I love this conversation, because when we talk about taking the things with us that are in us, right? Bringing those things up, remembering. For me, unschooling is such decolonization work, because that's what it does. When my daughter says, I don't want to do that, or for example, both of my daughters and I had locks for many years, and Sage, my youngest, had to like stop me one day and be like, I don't like my locks the way you like your locks, right? Like you keep doing my locks every 3 weeks and blah, blah, blah. And it takes a lot of time and I don't want to. And at first, such a simple thing. I'm like, well, of course you don't want to, but I don't want your hair to look messy and blah, 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 blah. And being with that, and the way that she responded to my response again, was a university degrees worth times a bazillion.
Yes. Come on.
Because the way she looked at me as if it was absurd, because it was, for me to decide that an aspect of her body or her appearance was mine to decide and enforce.
Let's go.
I had heard and read of that same sort of shit in all places, but it did not matter until Sage Nyambi fixed her face, her, not just her mouth, because she hadn't even said that second part yet. It was her eyebrows to be like, what? You know, and I'm like, what you mean, what? You know, because that's usually where we start.
Yeah.
I'm not usually like, yeah, no, I'm like, what, nuckety, what, blah. Like, that's our relationship. But there's so much knowledge and learning in that. And then even what I just said about that's our relationship, for so long for me, that was the norm until I recognized how much the myth of white supremacy and my own indoctrination into colonization, the practices of it, were informing my parenting lens. Like, so much of what I called responsible parenting was really that.
Yes,
it was
internalized. Like,
completely.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm constantly having to excavate.
Yes.
And be like, oh, you know, I think of like with my babies, with reparenting, constantly for me being like, oh, there's this thing that I have a muscle memory tendency towards. That's the activation of like, some of it is actually really dope. I want to snuggle my babies. And some of it is like, yo, why are you talking to your child like this?
Exactly.
And like, you can see your child be like, and you're kind of like, yeah, you got that. You know, I have more and more moments where I'm just kind of like, okay, the lesson is in this moment. Like you said earlier, this is exactly where the moment is, where it's like, Papi, when you talk to me like that, it scares me and I don't want to do it.
Or why the hell are you talking to me like that? Because that one's easier, Iraq. Like, when they come, at least for me, when my kids come from the space of like, you know, how I like people to talk to me, it's fine. What's hard for me to account for is when they show their real feelings. They don't, and I'm not even talking about, you know, anything wild. I'm just saying, Mom, why would you such and such? Like the same way I would when it's like, Brian, why didn't you send me the link? Is that, you know?
Respectability politics in our household.
Exactly. And so, and my daughters, because they are free people, are so versed in calling that, you know, like raising that and saying, this is not okay. And so I get to be with not just the layer of like, okay, politeness, or even some of the dynamics of unschooling being very much painted with this brush of like a free kid, meaning they do whatever the hell they want, which is really like the whitish idea of unschooling in terms of pervasive whiteness. We don't operate like that.
It's the fear, like whiteness, just like with land back, right? Like Dr. Kim Tallbear says very incredibly, like, when Indigenous people say land back, white people immediately think Indigenous folks and First Nation folks are going to do to them what they do to us.
Exactly.
Oh, for sure.
We're not going to suddenly say, y'all, there are no, like, get out of our borders, right? We're doing some other invitation, and it's the same thing. It's the same thing with inside of here.
It's the same thing. It's very much the same thing, and it is, and that's why I really value partnership and in parenting, because I feel like parenting is a portal, right? Or being an auntie or whatever, like parenting in the broader sense, not in the idea of the biology or even adoption. That is something that, you know, is done in that sort of collective way. And it has a lot of intuitive elements. And it's also a portal in that so much of the stuff we can see ourselves as liberation minded out there. And I can call out something that somebody out there might say wrong, but in my home, those same tools of oppression are ones that I normalize, and also ones that I'm afraid to face because we don't have the level of language and practice with what to do when we recognize those things. Jen talks about you recognize it. So I talk about awareness, disruption, deschooling, and unschooling, right? So the awareness is like, oh, this is a problem for whatever reason. When will take a stop, right? And then there's the disruption. So it's like, what is it in that moment that comes up that makes this thing something I'm going to come back to? Like Iraq said, like one of those moments that you're going to remember. Where's the disruption? And also, how can I nurture it? How can I nurture that?
Yes,
That's it.
And siblings,
That's it.
what the underlying thing that you're getting to, which is the truth about all systems of domination and oppression, is you are asking yourself at each moment, how do I have power with rather than power over, which is an indigenized form, right? It's like, I'm not your parent and I'm in charge of you. I'm a good relative. And you might have come from my body, but if I'm being a good relative to you, Zara, as a Black trans girl, how do I have power with you rather than power over? And that's not an invitation for coercion. That's an invitation for consent and collaboration, for resource sharing, for creativity. It's naturally generative because everything within Blackness is expansive and generative, whether it's
absolutely
right, Latinx, like,
and you do not have to try to figure out a way to embody it. So much of it is allowance, which I think the myth of white supremacy and colonization has also turned into a really passive thing. The idea of observing or allowing being passive, when just like with plant medicine, it is that allowance, right? It is that connection beyond that. It opens. It also is a space where things that are ruptured get something, like something gets to go through those spaces too. And I don't even need to know that they're ruptured for them to heal. And
wow.
And when we're in partnership, those ciphers are happening in all sorts of ways. When you pass each other in the hallway, and then that then is part of the stew that you take with you when you go out into your community. So, and that's the other thing, because unschooling is not a thing that some people of privilege do in their home. All it is saying, my liberation work is not separate from how I relate intergenerationally, whether it's kid or my elders. Therefore, the same lens, the same critical analysis, the same love, the same appreciation, the same unpacking, all of those things that I do with all that other shit, I'm also gonna do it in my home and recognize the ways that I'm also complicit in using those tools of oppression to raise and be free.
Yes.
I think I want to just bring one more thread in there that you've all been kind of circling around, which is this notion of the way it's landing for me is self-compassion. Basically, like as we, you talked about awareness and then deschooling, but in that process of recognizing something that we have not previously seen, how do we hold space for that past self or present self? And I wanted to bring Jen back in here because I think this is a theme that we've talked about and has come up a lot in your Parenting Mojo, which is a lot of folks, a lot of Jen's audience, like I suspect most of yours, is mostly female, and in Jen's case, often mostly white. And Jen and I have had a couple of conversations around, as folks are stepping into this process of unlearning, it's both very jarring and, if you move through the jarring, very liberating. And so I'm curious, Jen, how you think about, for the audience that you hold, your responsibility in holding that space as you yourself are going through this journey, which you spoke to earlier. And specifically, like, how do you get at the element of self-compassion that doesn't, I think Erock said it nicely, something to the effect of like, with your parents, right? Like love them, revere them, and hold them accountable. So I wonder if you might want to turn that frame on ourselves, and if there's something there for like, how do we hold self-compassion and self-accountability at the same time?
Yeah, I think firstly, I'd like to draw together a few threads from what the group has been talking about, and then relate that to self-compassion. Because to me, I mean, just sitting here as sort of the embodiment of the parenting advice world, it's awesome to be sitting here with you all, in particular, having this conversation. And I think it's so hard for even for white parents, maybe even especially for white parents who don't even see that the world that they're living within has these patriarchal elements to it that are shaping our responses without us even being conscious of it. And the idea that we need to see our child's behavior, like Akila said, as the signal that something needs to be different, and create a pause. And then, what Jasmine and Erock were saying about making a choice to do something different. And when we first learn that, we find ourselves in this almost untenable position where we look back at the choices that we've been making thus far, and we see kind of all the things we've been doing wrong, as it were, for so long, and the impact that those choices our parents made have had on us, and the impact that the choices we have made have had on our children. And that, yeah, self-compassion is a really important part of that we can only do the best that we can with the knowledge that we have at the time, even as we recognize that it is our privilege as white people, that is allowing us to exist within this system that doesn't acknowledge those power structures at play.
That's not a privilege though, Jen. Like, I want to offer you the grace that, like, what, you know, self-compassion for a white person whose initial formation of identity was through the lens of oppression means that you didn't get the opportunity to form a self that was not related to being an agent of violence and domination. And so self-compassion for a white person then is to say, who am I absent of being complicit to capitalism, patriarchy?
What else is there? Yeah.
And then when you find that self, and when you find it, you'll start finding indigeneity and Blackness being centered, right? And when you find that self, then choosing retroactive compassion of, like, I didn't even have a self to be compassionate toward. And now this new form of a self that is anti-oppressive in practice and in analysis, I will have compassion because everything about my programming was toward violence, but I'm transforming it, right? That's your transformative justice work. That's your transformative parenting. But a lot of parents start with, like, how can I be self-compassionate as a parent, and how can I be a good anti-racist parent? But you haven't even formed an identity outside of capitalism. And so when you get in those, like Bruce Lee taught us, like, when we are in the middle, like Bruce Lee was like, when you are getting hit, you are going to default to training. And if you're training to be like a violent white feminist, that's your training toward your child, towards yourself. And so you have to retrain. You have to adopt new embodiment.
Yeah, because actually when Brian said self-compassion, it actually was like, it almost felt like a shift for me. It didn't actually feel like a continuation of that conversation, in part because of what Jasmine mentioned, because similarly in parenting, sometimes that focus on the self is premature. Like you need to go back a little bit more. Otherwise, it can also become, not always, but it can become harmful, because doing the best I can is not enough.
Well, this is just who I am, right? This is who I am.
Right.
Yes.
So the ecology of that accountability we talked about. Yeah.
I say,
go ahead, Iraq, go ahead.
Just quickly, when I think about, like, I always say, or I like to repeat, it's a self-reflection and a self-evaluation over self-flatulation, which is often taught, right? So the shame as, like, this kind of thing. And then that compassionate inquiry. Like, so I think those things can exist. And then I look at nature, because we are of nature, but we pretend we're not. And I remember what nature teaches us. And when you see snake skin, they shed their skin because they're growing. They don't look back at that skin and say, ew, this is disgusting. They grow. And it's the same. I've used the story of, like, how we always kind of go, the butterfly. And I go, hey, caterpillar. And it's like, how do we recognize that? The sexiness in this metamorphosis movement, in this shift of nature. So that's how I look at self-evaluation or self-compassion.
Yes.
I didn't used to. I used to be like, I was worse. I'm this. I'm that. And I would identify, and that the policeman in my head was absolutely telling me that I wasn't enough. But that often I can tie that to colonizer religion.
Yes. all the things, right? They're all completely. Even the transformation thing, as you said, the butterfly, that is also an example of that for me, because in a lot of the spaces where people are trying to do change work, especially anti-racism, anti-Black racism, healing work and all of that, it's this idea of transformation, which is a nice little package. It would feel really good to be like, yes, after this training, you'll be transformed.
Yes, please.
Dude, can we focus on the practice? Can we focus on language and practice so that transformation can emerge over and over and over and over again?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, maybe this is the point of the conversation to pivot into that invitation, Akila, around practice. I'm thinking maybe to play with Iraq's metaphor there. It's like, what's happening in the chrysalis, right? Like, what is that goo? Like, what is the practice in there to emerge out the other side? And this conversation is the day after the autumnal equinox up here in the north has arrived, and the vernal equinox in the Southern Hemisphere, it's a time of transformation or transition, we should say. So maybe the closing invitation here, this is Lucia, by the way.
Hi, Lucia.
Speaking of parenting and reparenting, is maybe just go around briefly, and I think we'll start with Iraq, if you can set a tone here that's relatively brief.
Yeah.
What is the practice? If we're going to be Bruce Lee and take our lumps, which we will, what kind of practice should we be reverting to right now to help get us through this?
And we'll get an opportunity to say goodbye after that, or is this goodbye?
Yeah, and then we'll do a closing checkout. So maybe just a minute or two a piece on a practice, and then we'll.
I'm gonna speak to two, and I'm gonna say them quickly. One of them that I practice with my babies is this kind of round robin gratitude circle that happens within us. So it can be 1 round, or it can be 10 rounds, and you can pass, right? And so with the children, it could be something like, I was grateful for the cinnamon buns we had today. And then we'll be like the reaction or the responses, ashe. And then the next child might be like, and you get to kind of like see, what are they thinking, right? What was the thing that was for them, right? I'm grateful for the hug I got earlier. I'm grateful for the time I got to, and you go around, and that practice of just kind of constant, for me, gratitude of recognizing that I am often living, like my spirit is free. I am liberated spiritually. Right. And so often what that means for me, because I know that we have to fight against the oppression of like, we have to get liberated. Right. So, but what that means for me is to ground myself in gratitude. I know I can fly. I'll fly with the best of them. Most people learn how to fly and don't know how to land, or they don't get rooted, or they don't go into that roots of like, what's at the bottom of that beautiful tree that we're coming from, to go back to nature. And for me, that gratitude is that like soil, that root, that ant, like that's so that practice of gratitude that can be as simple as inviting your children into, what are you grateful for today? And they might say, I was grateful for dinner, or they might say pass. And you go, ashe, and you just, you're like, hey, you know what? That's not where I'm at right now. I'll tell you what I wasn't feeling, right? And that's okay too. And then another practice for me is the decompression, especially right now during this moment where there's remote teaching, where there is overstress, like we are being attacked constantly. We are at this war, and in that there needs to be some form of decompression that you owe to yourself and to your children and to your ancestry, and for me that turns into, when the babies are asleep, I take a hot shower. That hot shower turns into burning candles, saying gratitude, prayers, music. It might be the time for me to take an edible. It might be the time to me, but it's a moment for me. It's a moment of decompression, and I might cry, I might laugh, and so just inviting parents to be like, when you finally get that moment, what do you do with it? Instead of, and also you could just be drained. But for me, that helps me to be a better drained. So I'll pass. Thank you.
Cheers. We will do Jasmine, Jen, Akila, and look to close here.
Recently in our family, we do a lot of, cite your sources, thank your elders and the folks who have given things. Stacey Haynes and folks with generative somatics and the politics of trauma, all of those practitioners, just so much gratitude for how the risk of educating and providing offerings and practice have transformed me and my family. So we really try to practice centered accountability in our space. So much about my woundedness around mothering and not being the right kind of mother, because like I'm a BDSM practitioner, and like I'm pro-ho, and I'm queer, and I'm all these different things. I'm all these like third space identities. I always have that narrative of like, I'm not doing it right. And part of how my trauma shows up in my body is when there's a moment of constriction or discomfort, I am conditioned to be over accountable, because my original abusers who, caused me sexual violence as a young person told me it was my fault. So I was like, must be. So now I'm gonna, anytime there is an intersection of discomfort, I become over responsible. And I learned that over responsibility was calling me to focus on everybody else's stuff. So I didn't have to be centered in responsibility to what was happening on the inside of my body, on the inside of my home. That shows up in like dissociation or like rescuing behaviors. And so my children are also sexual assault survivors, and they're manifesting some of those same behaviors. So we have open conversations about how can we be centered in accountability, and then how can we create a safe container to be like, that's your stuff, not mine. And so when my 10-year-old Aries is like, actually, it seems like you're making meaning of that and it's not me. I'm like,
ooh. Okay, Aries.
Okay. So Sheila, I heard you talk about like raising 3 children, and Addison needs to come live with her, like her auntie Akila, because this Virgo can't handle it. So there's that.
Come through.
And then because some of my trauma and woundedness as a light-skinned person who understands the impact of colorism, and also being told that like I'm in that third space, like I'm descendant Cherokee and Black, but still not Black, or I'm all Black and I'm not Cherokee enough. I've had to figure out how to like take up space and spread out in ways that doesn't harm my dark-skinned siblings, but also allows me to get in contact with that dignity that I deserve as a Black Indigenous woman. And so my mother was dispossessed because she married a Black man during Loving v. Virginia. And so she was like, and then her family decided that they would not be Cherokee, they would be white, because there was some incentive for that. And so I'm happy to announce part of my practice this finalizing this week that I get to show y'all is I have my grandmother's enrollment number in the Cherokee Nation as citizen. And I applied for my mother's citizenship so that she can take off of her birth certificate that she is white and she can be the Cherokee woman that she is. And then I will enroll, and I will no longer be a Black dispossessed Cherokee, and neither will my children. And so that has been one of my reparenting practices.
Reparenting.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you for everything.
Beautiful, Jasmine.
Beautiful.
Thank you for bringing that in. We'll go to Jen and Akila to close here.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Jasmine. That was really powerful. I think that the practice that I have found most helpful when I'm looking to shift this in myself is the practice of pausing and noticing when when my child is doing something that is inciting some kind of response in me. All the things that you talked about your children doing. My kid does them too. And of course, when we initially notice and we think, okay, yeah, I need to pause here, and there's no space. It feels like there's no space there, and our reaction just follows. And we can look back afterwards and we say, oh yeah, I should have paused. I should have done something different there. And then if we keep focusing on it, that space can increase just a tiny bit. And maybe in the beginning, it's not enough for us to make a different choice, but if we keep focusing on it, we can eventually get ourselves in a position where we can actually make a different choice, that our gut reaction that's formed from these patriarchal white supremacist systems doesn't have to be the response that we give, that we want to control our child's body, that we want to control their actions, that we can actually choose a different path. And to me, the pause is the critical step in making that happen.
Thank you.
Yes. And I see our time too. This is so dope. I really appreciate this. So confident autonomy is what I call like the umbrella, I guess, for what we practice. And it has to be really easy, because I like for things to be easy when they can be. And it's just that we start with it being open as much as possible. So we try to remove borders and then talk about discerning what boundaries might look like instead. So that shows up as no bedtime, no, like these ideas of when they should do the things they do and eat what they want to eat and blah, blah. That's really our practice. Our practice is, what would it be like for you to be confidently autonomous? So you need to stay up late, because that's your practice of learning that after you stay up for 12 hours straight, your head starts to hurt and you don't like it. So you don't want to do it, or you like to go to bed early so then you can wake up early because no one else is up and you have the whole place to yourself. So our practice is confident autonomy. And the main way that we do it is by not starting off with borders, but instead looking at what are boundaries and what do they look like and when do they change and all of that.
So much wisdom and vulnerability and experience and beauty here. I'm just feeling super grateful, and I'm glad that Viviana,
y'all are dope,
has joined us to take in some of this wisdom. I asked if they're allowed to come in. I was like, well, be pretty inappropriate and authentic not to, so come on in.
Good.
I'm super grateful to Iraq and Jasmine and Jen and Akila for bringing all of yourselves into the space. It's really it's gorgeous. And part of the impetus for me behind building belonging is to create the spaces I wish existed. This is the space I wish existed, and I wish I could be part of it all the time. And I so appreciate everything y'all are bringing. And Olive, who's part of Building Belonging, is helping me, Angela Livestream right now, offered a closing reflection, which we probably don't have time to get into, but I'll just offer it out there, and then invite just a closing mood check for everyone. So that what Olive invited us to consider is, what would you say to your 5-year-old self? Kind of picking up on Iraq's story earlier. And the invitation to folks on the live stream, since that's a bigger one, and maybe one just to reflect as we take it offline, is just I like the frame here of moving from decolonized to indigenized. And just yesterday on my podcast feed, 2 different conversations. Trina Green Brown, who will be part of next week's conversation on parenting and belonging, has a podcast where she just hosted one on decolonizing parenting. And at the same time, Cindy Wang Brand, who has another podcast, Parenting Forward, had a conversation the same day on decolonizing parenting. So it feels like we're moving into that space of decolonization. I'm really curious and interested about that next step that you all kind of spoke to around, from decolonization to indigenous. I'm not sure I'm getting the term right, indigeneity. That feels alive. So anyway, in that spirit, the embodied practice we want to invite people into at the end here is just to speak to one feeling in your body that is coming from below your neck for those of us indoctrinated in white supremacy culture, trying to be less cerebral. So for folks in the chat here, we'll do a closing mood check. Where are you at? What are you feeling? Just a word or two. And for folks in the live stream, if you want to type that in as well, invite you to participate with us alongside. I will pass to somebody and then invite you to pass to the next person. So I'll go to Iraq.
Word.
Sorry, let me speak.
I'm feeling like I'm ready to. Oh, go ahead. Oh, you first.
I should go first.
Gotcha.
No, it's my bad. I'm feeling very full, very replete. Sorry.
Okay. I'm gonna put some coins in parenting as politicals cash. That's all I'm saying. Thank y'all. I'm feeling reflective. I'm feeling my listening muscles are really wanting to hear more. So thank you all. And I'll pass it to Jasmine.
Tension comes up for me when white people start talking about decolonizing themselves. So I want to name that. And also tension comes up for me when we mainstream or commodify a phrase that is definitely centered in like Black Indigenous folks seeking liberatory practices and returning home. And so I want to also name that. And then I will just extend my gratitude and thanks for how this space has been held. I understand that there are 2 white folks and how complicated that is, particularly as a person who is a white man, having feeling like you gotta like respect the container of the time and the programming with people who are like, nah, we just gonna do what we want to do. I'm not gonna apologize. I'm just gonna name that. What a fantastic invitation to practice in that space. And then I'll just pass it to whomever's next.
I'll go. I have a word, and I also want to share my book because it's very connected to all of this. Yeah, so the word that I feel is grounded. The space I feel is grounded. And my book, Raising Free People, is out, and it very much talks about the ways that Black, non-Black, Indigenous, and people of color are also recognizing decolonization, but also in many cases have practice beyond it, right? It may be in little sections, little slivers, and this book is filled with some of those stories, including Tamika, that Iraq and I have that homie in common.
Shout out to Tamika.
Yes, Tamika Middleton, Gullah Geechee folk. But yeah, so I'm feeling really good about that, and also just feeling grounded. With gratitude is also a part of groundedness for me. So much gratitude for all of this. Yeah.
Okay, Raising Free People.
Yeah.
Yes, and my sis Dee Dee spoke into the discomfort that I was feeling. Dee Dee said that when we talk about decolonization, they center certain indigenous folks, the people who in your imagination is the Plains Indian with the headdress and goes powwow, rather than acknowledging that Blackness is indigeneity. And that's why I feel that discomfort. And I also want to name for my own woundedness, because I am a descendant of the Cherokee Nation. I am on the precipice of becoming a citizen, to be validated that those who looked more, who had their roll numbers, who looked more Native than me because I was read as Black, were validated as indigenous. And so that's my own stuff coming up, is like, if white people are centering decolonization and indigeneity, they're not going to pick me. They're going to pick my cousin in a headdress.
Yeah.
And so yes, thank you for naming that, Dee Dee.
Shout out Dee Dee.
So I want to, I think, respond to Jasmine's feeling tension and acknowledge that I'm definitely feeling tension there as well. And you know, it's so common for discussions in the parenting space to, I mean, for the people in those conversations to look like me, and those conversations tend to be comfortable and tend to be, you know, grounded in scientific evidence, and so I think that, yes, that tension is there. And also, I mean, in a way, it feels amazing to be challenged and to be stretched in ways that I know that I need to be stretched in, and that the people who are listening to my work need to be stretched in as well. And so I want to thank Brian for pulling these folks together, and to Jasmine and Iraq and Akila for being here and for helping us all to do this work that needs to be done.
Turns out it's super hard. We can't do it alone. Yeah, grateful to all of you. And I'm hoping, you know, hopefully you'll have a chance to watch that. So this recording will be available. The folks here who are on the Zoom part of it, I encourage you to watch it too, because the comments that are coming in, which I'm seeing on the side here, are really quite beautiful. So
looking forward to that.
Thanks to the folks who joined the live stream. Yeah, please do. You know, Jasmine and Jen and Akila all have podcasts. Their information is in the YouTube description there that you can find. Akila's new book is extraordinary. I really, really hope people step into it. And Iraq's got all kinds of practices that you can find. The one thing I want to just flag is next week we're having the sister or brother or kindred conversations. This one, parenting and belonging. So this is about reparenting, looking at ourselves as a side of transformation. Next week's about parenting, looking at children. Like this one as a side of transformation. And that's featuring Julietta Skoog, Arnina Cashton, and Trina Green Brown, and also promises to be lots of fun. I will just name that I'm also sitting with all this tension and don't enjoy necessarily facilitating these things. Don't think I have a particular skill set on reparenting that Lord knows I'm practicing. So grateful to be here.
Word.
I'm going to invite Olive to come back on screen so people who were interacting with her can see who you've been talking to. And then Olive, you get the last word. No pressure.
Hi, Olive. Thank you for your labor.
Thank you, Olive. Thank you.
Appreciate it.
So I've been in the back.
I didn't warn her, so.
I've just been in the background.
Olive just wrote in the chat, can a white person not have the last word, please? I'm like, all right, Olive, you asked for it.
Thank you, Olive. And let's do it.
It was actually Dee Dee who put that in the live stream, and I am sitting here. I am literally bouncing up and down. My skin is, I have goosebumps all over. I feel so filled. I feel so challenged. I feel so stretched. I feel so grateful. I am echoing all the words that I've heard and earned because I listened to all of you today. Thank you. Thank you for sharing your wisdom. Thank you for fighting the good fight. This is a fight worth fighting for. Thank you. Bye.
Peace, y'all.
I say.
Stop the live stream out there in cyberspace here. Thanks to everyone for joining. Do I want